This video is about plots of land, cadastral units and title numbers. It might become quite complex quite quickly, so it's probably going to be best to review it. It's also based on the analysis of Scottish law, but the implications are probably generic. So just to set the scene, from a modelling point of view, the 2012 Act, section 12.5, states that the cadastral unit number is to be the title number of the plot of land which that unit represents. So all cadastral units stem from title numbers, and it almost implies that there's a one-to-one correlation. However, that's incompatible with section 3.7, which says that the keeper need not make up and maintain a title sheet for a plot of land which is appurtenant. So either title numbers come from cadastral units or title numbers don't come from cadastral units. So if there's not a one-to-one correspondence between plots of land, cadastral units and title sheets, let's think more deeply about the nature of that relationship, because it's a key relationship in terms of numbering and unique identifiers. So in the 2012 Act, section 3.4 defines a plot of land. A plot of land is an area or areas of land, all of which are owned by one person or one sets of persons. That seems quite reasonable and a good place to start. Section 3.5 makes clear that this includes separate tenements, so volumes of space can equally be owned by one person or one sets of persons. A lease is not a plot of land, it's a formalised right of possession in exchange for rent. So this is really about ownership, although there are things that can be in the jurisdiction that do things specifically for leases, and this is true in Scotland. And section 12.1 describes the transformative relationship between cadastral units and plots of land conferred by the registration process. So a cadastral unit is a unit which represents a single registered plot of land. So there can be plots of land outside of the registration process, but a registered plot of land is a cadastral unit. So a cadastral unit is a plot of land which has been registered. So this recognises the bijural nature of common law and registration law. We'll talk about the bijural nature of laws later on. So plots of laws and cadastral units, plots of land and cadastral units and cadastral map. Absolute and relative plots describe plots of land which, when registered, become cadastral units. The set of cadastral units represents all of the registered plots of land. The spatial representation of the set of cadastral units is a cadastral map. Cool. So the question then becomes, how do we start to ground these things together? So the option one, the relative plot, is grounded in the spatial extent of the absolute plot. So the spatial extent of a grounding absolute plot is defined in the legal instrument used to create the relative plot, i.e. the deed. This protects the relative plot against any changes in the spatial extent of the absolute plot. Because if you have your absolute plot, someone could, do a tuple at some point in time and cut it in half. Now that might make your relative plot make absolutely no sense subsequently. However, if you are grounding it against the parent deed, it will always make sense. Or you can ground it against the spatial extent of the absolute plot, and that is defined in that parent cadastral unit relationship. So this might bring in that legal ambiguity if there is a change to your absolute plot in the future. So how do you derive title numbers from cadastral units? When a title is derived from the cadaster, the relationship between different cadastral units determine how a title number is allocated, as we've just seen from the relative plot sides. In most cases, a cadastral unit number is used to create the title number. Nice and simple. However, in some cases, a cadastral unit is appurtenant of another cadastral unit. So, as described in section 3.7, we don't have to create a title sheet for pertinence. So how do we deal with pertinence in title derivation? Pertinence, as we've seen previously, is legal shorthand for describing both primary and subordinate heritable rights, which automatically pass to successive owners by implication. So in terms of title numbering, we're only interested in pertinence which are ownership rights. The only ownership rights capable of being held in a pertinential relationship are solum and conventional separate tenements. And again, this might change by jurisdiction. So what then are the relationships between cadastral units and title numbers? The relationship is either the title number is the same as the cadastral unit, represents the section 12.5 in the jurisdiction, i.e. the cadastral unit is not appurtenant, or the title number is derived from the cadastral unit number of the dominant plot when the cadastral unit is appurtenant. And so we can see that here. So is the cadastral unit appurtenant, i.e. is it owned by other cadastral units? If the answer is yes, it's a pertinential cadastral unit and the title number is inherited from the dominant cadastral unit when title is derived. If no, the title number is derived directly from the cadastral unit itself. So this gives us this matrix that allows us to determine how you get title numbers. You look at whether it comes from an absolute plot with an accurate spatial extent and its pertinential relationship. So we can see the types of scenarios in which you can actually undertake your title number derivation. So what is this pertinential cadastral unit as a new concept that we've introduced? So by definition, a pertinential cadastral unit must be owned by a cadastral unit. Let's just change that. In most instances, a pertinential cadastral unit will be owned exclusively or in common by cadastral units. In these instances, the pertinential cadastral unit will never be materialized in a title in its own right. That's quite key. So when cadastral units own land, it is only ever as a proxy for natural or non-natural parties. Land must ultimately be owned by natural or non-natural parties, and a chain of title reflects this ownership. Theoretically, though, a cadastral unit and a different party type could own land in common. In this situation, a title must be able to be derived to reflect the natural or non-natural ownership, party's ownership. The recommendation is that such mixed ownership is legislated against, so it just can't happen, although clearly your jurisdiction will come up with whatever way it deems suitable if it reflects a social need. This then brings us on to this issue of inheritance. So if a cadastral unit A has ownership interest in the pertinential cadastral unit B, which in turn has ownership interest in the pertinential cadastral unit C, what is the relationship between A and C? Clearly, this would depend upon the legislation and jurisdiction. However, conceptually, A clearly inherits a beneficial ownership interest in C from B. This should be narrated when title is derived for A. This is even more important if, as a pertinential cadastral unit, no title is ever materialized for B or C, as the rights described for C would never appear on a title. This inheritance principle is theoretically infinite. And so here we can see how this works in terms of a flat scenario. So here is a exclusive ownership of strata that gives a 50% ownership in common in some principal land. So there's two flats within this building, which gives a 50% ownership of some, say, garden space exclusive ownership of some garden space and 50% ownership of some other piece in common with someone else. So in terms of the title for this piece of owned strata, exclusive ownership of strata, half an ownership of the principal land that represents a flatted building, half an ownership of the principal land, which is probably some garden or garage space, and a quarter ownership of principal land, which is shared with some other party. Okay, we're now going to move on to the next section, which is registration systems.